Within Research Sector 02 at Site 19, a standard secure humanoid containment cell holds an entity that wears its profession like a second skin. The subject stands roughly 1.9 meters tall and bears the unmistakable silhouette of a medieval plague doctor. Thick robes hang from its shoulders. A long ceramic beaked mask covers its face. Heavy gloves cloak its hands. To the casual observer, the figure appears costumed in the garments of 15th century pestilence physicians. Closer examination reveals that these garments are not worn. They have grown. The robes are continuous with the body beneath, behaving as a thick hide built up over the skin. The mask is not a fitted prosthesis, but a chitinous outgrowth originating from the bones of the face. Imaging confirms that a humanoid skeletal structure exists beneath this layered exterior, though it has long since been subsumed by the encroaching apparel. The entity is designated SCP-049. Its object class is Euclid. It is generally cooperative. It is also, by every available measure, profoundly uncanny. Containment of the entity follows a layered protocol designed around its apparent cooperation and its capacity for sudden, lethal escalation. Before any transport, the subject is sedated. During movement between locations, it is secured within a Class 3 humanoid restriction harness, which includes a locking collar and extension restraints, and it is escorted at all times by no fewer than 2 armed guards. While the subject is generally agreeable in its interactions with Foundation personnel, any outburst or sudden behavioral shift is to be met with elevated force. Under no circumstances are personnel to come into direct physical contact with the entity during such episodes. Direct skin contact is itself the central hazard. In the event the subject becomes aggressive, researchers have documented that the application of lavender, specifically Lavandula multifida, produces a measurable calming effect on the entity. Once calmed, the subject reliably becomes compliant and will return to its containment cell with little or no resistance. The mechanism by which the plant produces this effect is unknown, though it is consistent enough to be considered standard containment practice. To facilitate ongoing study and containment, the subject was historically provided with the corpse of a recently deceased animal, typically a bovine or other large mammal, once every 2 weeks. The entity would operate upon these corpses for extended periods, using implements drawn from a black leather doctor's bag it carries upon its person at all times. The internal volume of this bag appears to exceed its external dimensions. The subject has been observed withdrawing instruments larger than the bag itself from within it. When these surgical procedures resulted in the creation of a reanimated specimen, designated SCP-049-2, such instances were removed from the cell and incinerated. Following a recent incident, the subject is no longer permitted to interact with human subjects, and all requests by the entity for human subjects are denied. A temporary update to containment, issued by Containment Committee Order 049.S19, further restricts the subject from direct interaction with any Foundation staff and prohibits the provision of any additional corpses for use in its surgeries. This order is to persist indefinitely, until such time as a consensus regarding the entity's long-term containment can be reached. The entity is fluent in a variety of languages, though it shows a clear preference for English and a form of medieval French. It has stated that it originated in 15th century France, while also describing itself as particularly well-traveled. In conversation, it is cordial, articulate, and at times disarmingly affable. It refers to its work in the language of a professional physician. It speaks of cures, of patients, of practice, and of progress. Its courtesy, however, is conditional. The subject will become irritated and at times openly aggressive if it feels itself to be in the presence of what it calls the pestilence. The exact nature of this pestilence is unknown to Foundation researchers. The subject has not been able to identify it by any recognized disease. It will not describe its symptoms in any consistent way. It speaks of the pestilence as a singular and universal affliction, an unspeakable horror that has shown its face many times and will again. To the entity, it is the only sickness that exists in the world of men. It is also, by its own account, the entity's lifelong purpose to eradicate it. When the subject identifies an individual as being affected by the pestilence, its behavior shifts. It will become hostile, and if not restrained, will attempt to kill the perceived patient. The method of killing is the entity's defining anomaly. Through direct skin contact, it is capable of causing all biological functions of an organism to cease. The exact mechanism remains undocumented. Autopsies performed on the entity's victims have, in every case, been inconclusive. After such killings, the subject has expressed frustration and, on occasion, remorse, indicating that the death itself has done little to defeat the pestilence. It will then typically proceed to perform a crude surgery upon the corpse, drawing instruments from its black bag. These surgeries are not always successful by the entity's own standards, but they frequently produce reanimated specimens. These specimens are designated SCP-049-2. They are the entity's stated cure. The reanimated specimens retain no recognizable memory or higher mental function. They possess only basic motor skills and rudimentary response mechanisms. In typical observation, they are inactive, shifting little, ambulating slowly when they move at all. They can, however, become extremely aggressive when provoked, or when directed to attack by the entity itself. Biological function within these specimens is active but markedly altered from baseline human physiology. The configurations of their organs and tissues differ from any known anatomy. Limbs may be inverted. Orifices appear where none should exist. Despite these obvious deviations, the entity routinely remarks that its patients have been cured. It speaks of them with the proprietary satisfaction of a physician who has completed difficult work. When pressed on the discrepancy between its description and the observed result, it grows defensive, then agitated. The cure, it insists, is most effective. The subject was discovered during the investigation of a series of unexplained disappearances in the town of Montauban in southern France. During a raid on a local home, investigators encountered several active instances of the -2 specimens, as well as the entity itself. While law enforcement personnel engaged the hostile reanimated forms, the subject was observed standing apart from the violence, watching the engagement, and taking notes in its leather journal. After the -2 instances were dispatched, the entity willingly entered Foundation custody, offering no resistance. An initial interview was conducted by Dr. Raymond Ham of Site 85. The subject opened the exchange in French before switching to English at Dr. Ham's prompting, addressing him as a colleague, a fellow man of medicine. It expressed relief that it had not been abducted by common street thugs. It observed the cleanliness of the interview room and remarked approvingly that there was little trace of the pestilence in such a place. When Dr. Ham asked what it meant by pestilence, the entity referred to it as the scourge, the great dying. It struggled to recall a specific name, tapping the side of its mask in apparent frustration, before insisting that the affliction abounded outside the walls and that many more would succumb until a perfect cure could be developed. Dr. Ham asked whether it was speaking of the bubonic plague. The subject paused. It said that it did not know what that was. The interview continued. Dr. Ham asked whether the entities encountered at the house had been dead when the subject first reached them, and whether it had then reanimated them. The subject demurred at the simplicity of the question. Life and death, it said, sickness and health, these were amateur terms for amateur physicians. There was only one ailment in the world of men, and that was the pestilence. The recovered specimens, it insisted, had been very ill. Dr. Ham observed that the things recovered had not been human. The entity paused, glared, and conceded only that its cure was not yet perfect. Time, it said, and further experimentation would resolve that. It then began to dictate terms, requesting a laboratory of its own and assistance, the latter of which, it noted with a small laugh, it could provide for itself in time. The interviewer recorded a particular note in the margin of the transcript. The subject communicates in a very human manner, and yet a strange sense of unease accompanies any time spent in its presence. Something about it, he wrote, is profoundly uncanny. The pointed wooden stick the entity had been gesturing with throughout the interview was confiscated under standard protocols, in part because it had been waved about with a menacing carelessness. The subject was displeased. Concessions were made. Test subjects, it was suggested, might be provided on a regular schedule for the benefit of ongoing research. Once installed at Site 19, the subject devoted itself to study. It would spend several days operating upon a provided mammalian corpse, then several more days documenting its findings within a thick leather journal kept inside its bag. The journal is written in no known language. Linguists and codebreakers have failed to decipher it. The subject often sought to share its findings with members of staff. In the first formal observation, a test subject from the disposable personnel pool was introduced into the cell. The entity expressed sincere gratitude. It asked the subject several standard medical questions while removing tools from its bag. Then, with sudden speed, it closed the distance and killed the subject with a single touch to the throat. It proceeded to make considerable alterations to the corpse, introducing fluids from within its bag by way of a hand-powered pump and copper tubing. The resulting specimen became animated. It flailed and grasped at the walls with a number of manufactured limbs while moaning out of an oblong orifice now present in its sternum. The entity took notes and remarked to the watching staff about the efficacy of its cure. When security entered to return the entity to containment, the new specimen attacked them. The team dispatched it. The entity returned to its cell without resistance, stating that it was pleased with the results. In a later observation, the corpse of a recently deceased goat was provided. The entity worked for several days and produced a reanimated instance. It described the result as satisfactory, noting that its veterinary practice was rudimentary, but that the patient had responded well. In another, the corpse of an orangutan was provided. The entity expressed particular gratitude due to the similarities between primate and human anatomy. It worked for several days reanimating the corpse, then returning to it 3 more times for further adjustments. After it was unable to reanimate the body a 5th time, it surrendered the corpse for incineration, lamenting that its early optimism had been misplaced and stating that more subjects of that kind would do a great deal to advance its research. A more detailed log records a session involving the corpse of a recently deceased bovine. The entity expressed mild annoyance at the provision, having repeatedly requested human subjects, but accepted it. It worked for several days, breaking only to dine on a requested meal of thin crackers, salted pork, and hard cheese. It has stated that it does not require sustenance but enjoys it, and that food helps to put it in the proper mindset to operate. It began by embalming the corpse. It then produced a number of long syringes from its bag, each containing a different dark and viscous fluid, which it described as essences of the humors. The pestilence, it explained, brings about a systemic imbalance, and before true healing can begin, one must find the humors in balance, lest the body reject the cure. It added, with audible condescension, that this was elementary knowledge for any practical physician. Over several days, it adjusted the organs of the bovine with large metal instruments. On the 8th day, it produced a lightning rod. Dr. Ham exchanged the rod for an electric cattle prod attached to an extension cord, which the entity accepted, and the corpse was struck in several locations. The bovine became ambulatory once again, despite the inversion of its head and the reorientation of its limbs. In the follow-up interview, Dr. Ham pressed the subject on its process. The entity declined to detail its methods, referring him instead to its journals. When Dr. Ham observed that he did not understand what the pestilence was, nor how turning creatures into quasi-living, mindless drones could be considered a cure, the entity grew suddenly agitated. Its cure, it insisted, was a true cure. The creature before them was clean, unable to spread the affliction, free from the terror it would otherwise have suffered. One does not, it said, wait for rotten timbers to bring down the hall before pulling them out. One does not mock the structure simply because it now looks different. The structure is strong. It is free of disease. The attending researcher's note recorded a quiet suspicion. The entity, he wrote, may be more aware of the reality of its outcomes than it would like its observers to think. On the 16th of April 2017, the pattern broke. Dr. Ham entered the test chamber for what was intended to be another routine interview. As he stepped inside, the entity grew anxious. It asked him whether he was feeling well. Following protocol, Dr. Ham reminded the entity that the interview was required. The entity became hostile. It killed him. Due to a lapse in security protocol, and because Dr. Ham did not activate the in-chamber emergency system, his body was not discovered for 3 hours. By the time staff entered the cell, the entity had converted him into an instance of SCP-049-2. In the interview that followed, conducted by Dr. Theron Sherman of Site 42, the entity at first refused to speak. When directed to explain itself, it said only that its actions did not need to be explained. When Dr. Sherman stated plainly that Dr. Ham had been killed and butchered, the entity interrupted, insisting that he was not dead. He was, it said, cured. Pressed on what disease Dr. Ham could possibly have presented with, the entity began to falter. The pestilence, it said, presents and progresses in unforeseeable fashions. It has a queer way of creeping into the unprepared. Its breathing grew heavier as it spoke. It called the killing a mercy. Dr. Sherman replied that the man was a vegetable. The entity grew angry. It accused the doctors of being not men of science but men of emotion, unable to appreciate the horrors it had seen, the many millions who had succumbed and been changed. Dr. Sherman ended the interview, declaring the entity's allowances revoked. As the recording ran out, the entity continued speaking, its words trailing into something quieter. It had saved him, it said. Dr. Ham had been sick. It knew he had been sick. They were all sick. But it could save them. It could cast the plague down, once and for all. Only it could do this. It was the cure. 3 weeks later, in a closing interview conducted by Dr. Elijah Itkin, the entity was asked whether it felt any remorse for what it had done. It waved a gloved hand. The death of a colleague, it said, was always regrettable. But in the face of the pestilence, one must be swift and act without hesitation. It noted, with something approaching enthusiasm, that the incident had provided important insight. Living human subjects, it had concluded, were the only way to proceed forward. Its desires now turned towards tending to those still living who suffered from the disease. Dr. Itkin informed it that it would be disappointed. The entity laughed quietly. "Oh, doctor," it said, "I would not be so sure." The leather journal, still kept inside the impossibly deep black bag, continues to be filled. The language remains undeciphered. The entity remains, by all available measures, cooperative. It also remains, beneath the layered hide and the chitinous mask, watchful and patient.